Good evening. My name is Leo Casey. I'm Executive Director of the Albert Shanker Institute. And it is my distinct pleasure to invite you all tonight to our webinar of the American Federation of Teachers and the Shanker Institute on saving our democracy. I do want to say that this event is designed to be interactive, and so you should write questions that you have for our panelists in the comments box as we go along, and we will be able to direct some of them to them. It is my main job tonight to introduce my good friend, Randi Weingarten. Randi Weingarten is a high school social studies and civics teacher on leave from New York City Public Schools to lead the American Federation of Teachers' 1.8 million members, many of which are pre-K-12 teachers and higher education faculty. Randi always says that the AFT is at the intersection of two great democratic movements, public education and the labor movement. And you can see the great dedication that she takes to leading an organization that is in that place. American democracy is her passion. Without any further ado, let me give you Randi Weingarten.
Thank you, Leo. And what Leo didn't say to everyone is that Leo and I actually co-taught at Clara Barton High School, and we taught AP Gov, and we actually had our kids debate in the We the People competitions and engage kids in a way of civic advocacy that was just wonderful to watch and wonderful to see the trajectory upon which they went. And ultimately, it does feel like those were the halcyon days, even though in the New York City school system at that point, we were fighting all sorts of fights about issues of austerity and having textbooks that said John Kennedy when Bill Clinton was president, and on and on. But you know, it feels like a time long gone where at least people actually did respect a democracy. And part of what we're doing today is we are actually talking about or engaged in, I think, a 5-alarm fire for our democracy. And I am really, really, really glad to have this panel to discuss it because there can't be enough conversations about what the stakes of this election are. Many of us talk a lot about the bread and butter stakes, about the stakes of the fact that we're in a COVID crisis, we're in a recession, we're in, we're in a reckoning on racism. Last week we had a town hall about climate, but today we are talking about democracy. And I would say it's no exaggeration to say that American democracy is on the ballot this year. Ultimately, if Donald Trump remains in power, if Donald Trump remains in power by overturning the will of the people as expressed by their votes, American democracy will have been dealt a deadly blow. And it's not simply that he is the first American president to refuse to accede to the peaceful transfer of power, but just look on a day-to-day basis, such as his saying that he needs a 9th Supreme Court justice so that that justice can throw out the ballots. How many of these examples do we need to say and to see and to believe that we have a 5-alarm fire? And ultimately, even if there is an unprecedented change in the polling, and so Donald Trump remains in power in that way, there will always be a question of what is happening in terms of the intervention that has happened in terms of the Russians or others. Obviously, elections have always been important. They've always carried real consequences, but this is the most consequential election in our lifetime for America's democracy. And ultimately, I would say that the historians that you're going to hear from today, as well as the amazing lawyers like Eric Holder, will ultimately talk about what those stakes are. From the moment that Donald Trump announced his candidacy in 2016, he has mounted attack after attack on our democratic institutions and on the norms that allow those institutions to work. Whether it was seeking Russian intervention in our elections, to attacking the free press, to attacking an independent judiciary, whether it is the threat of jailing his political opponents, like most recently what he said, I think it was just last week, about jailing President Obama, about indicting Vice President Biden and jailing Hillary Clinton, to the demagogic, hateful attack on Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, Muslims, immigrants, and I go on and on. From his creating the secret federal paramilitary force to using tear gas on peaceful protesters to imprisoning children at the border, it is a constant attack on our democracy and our norms from Donald Trump. He will stop at nothing as long as he is in the White House. And if he continues in the White House past January 20th, we have no idea what will happen next other than, well, I shouldn't say that. Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Livitsky actually tell us what will happen next. I want to just focus on the latest and most critical attack in the judgment of this high school social studies teacher. And that is the refusal by both President Trump and Vice President Pence. They were both asked at their debates, and they both refused to commit to a peaceful transition of power should they lose the election. This refusal strikes at the very core of a democracy, the ability of we the people to choose who will govern us in free and fair elections. And for many years, as a social studies teacher and as a civics teacher in New York City, I taught my students the Declaration of Independence, including the central notion that the just powers of government are based on the consent of the governed. In a recent piece that Leo and I co-authored, we wrote that in those classes, our students learned that America gives, or Americans, frankly, give their consent to be governed through their votes, and that a failure to respect the verdict of those votes mean that the American democracy or the American government would no longer be a democracy. And I see that the URL of that piece is being scrolled beforehand. This is a real life civics lesson. I can't express this any more seriously or emphatically, that when someone refuses to adopt or acknowledge the peaceful transition of power, that means they are refusing to recognize what the people have said in a free and fair election, and they are refusing to acknowledge the consent of the governed. Ultimately, we may have to fight that fight after November 3rd. But before November 3rd, there is something that you can do about it. I suspect that there are very few people on this stream that are in favor of the current president. But whether you are, or whether you are in favor of Joe Biden, or whoever you are in favor of, you as an American citizen who is over 18, you have the right to vote. You have the right to vote in person. In most states, you have the right to vote early, or you have the right to vote by mail. In this, the most important election of our lifetime, the most important thing I can say to you is please vote. Vote and get other people to vote so that this can be a decisive election where the people are telling those who govern us who they want to govern. Because just as the citizens of Belarus are doing now, and so many people around the world have done, we need to defend, we need to have a free and fair election, and then we need to defend that election should there be efforts to overturn the results of it. And that defending of that election is not simply going to be in the courts. That defending of that election is going to be on streets as well. But most important right now, between now and November 3rd, we need the people of America who have the right to vote, and that right to vote is sacrosanct and the right upon which so many other rights lie. We need people to go out and vote. So at the AFT, we are committed to the 4 following essentials points. Number 1, every American registered to vote must be able to vote. In the midst of this pandemic, that means people have to have access to early voting and vote by mail. As Eric Holder and others have taught me over the last several years, all of the voter suppression, we keep on fighting and fighting and fighting, but we are fighting for every American who is registered to vote, be able to vote, and have access to early voting. Number 2, every vote must be counted. We have talked about that in so many different elections, but given the conditions of this pandemic, that probably means we may not know the final count on election night, and that count must go on until all mail ballots are counted. Number 3, the vote of the people must be respected. We, the people, decide who governs us. And number 4, as I said earlier, we will defend the vote and American democracy and not be intimidated or bullied into silence or acquiescence by Trump and by others on who are engaged in trying to bully and threaten, including the militias and the white supremacists. So last thing I'll say before I turn to our distinguished guests is that we're trying to talk about and engage people in democracy in all sorts of ways. This town hall is one of them. A year ago, we had a full day on talking about democracy, where some of our speakers today were involved and engaged. But we also have another piece of a petition that we are going to invite people to join in the next few days. Yale professor Tim Snyder, NEA President Becky Pringle, and I, as well as a number of other national education leaders, many of who have been involved in the teaching of civics, have put together a very short statement. And so we're going to see if people are engaged enough, willing enough to sign this statement, teachers, K-12, and higher education teachers from across the country. And the statement simply says, we, the undersigned pre-K educators and higher education educators, representative of schools across the United States, endorse democracy as a means of giving voice to each one of us, expressing the dignity of each individual, of representing the values of our society, and of ensuring the lawful transition of authority. Every freedom depends upon the freedom to vote. Each vote counts, count each vote. And ultimately, what we're driving at is to see thousands and thousands of educators from across the country signing on to the simple proposition of every vote counts in our democracy, and we will defend that proposition each and every day of our lives. So tonight, we have 4 distinguished individuals who will discuss this idea of saving our democracy. And and 3 of them have critical essays in the current edition of the AFT journal American Educator, which you can access at the website, which I think will be scrolling on your screens shortly. Those essays are available on the web. They're available for free for high school teachers and higher education faculty to use with their students. And we have sent the magazine to each and every one of our members in the last couple of weeks. First, we have our dear friend and one of the most important and transformational attorney generals in American history, and that is Eric Holder, a graduate of the New York City Public Schools. Yay! Eric served as Attorney General under President Barack Obama. He was the first African American to hold that position and the third longest serving Attorney General in American history, both as Attorney General as well as his current position as the head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Eric has been a tireless, fierce, strategic, brilliant fighter for voting rights, seeing around the corners what is going on in terms of gerrymandering and suppression and all the kind of antics and tactics to try to suppress the vote. And Eric will have to leave early tonight, so I'm going to ask Eric our first questions. Second, we have the authors of the book How Democracies Die, Stephen Livitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And I told both Stephen and Daniel, who are professors of government at Harvard University, that this is probably the most read and referred to book in my and Sharon's library. They are amongst the leading authorities on the comparative study of democracies around the world. And in the wake of President Trump's election in 2016, they co-authored this book, which really describes in very scary and very direct, compelling terms how authoritarian rule can replace democratic government without a coup, and what citizens need to do to defend democracy. And then finally, we have another intrepid writer and advocate, Suzanne Nossel. Suzanne is Chief Executive Officer at PEN America, an organization that defends the human rights of authors and writers. She is the author of a recent published book, Dare to Speak, where she makes a case for how we should engage in peaceful protests and other acts of free expression as ways that respect the rights of others and ways that actually root democracy in our muscle membrane. So let me start with, first, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank Leo for having the idea to do this tonight. But let me ask Attorney General Holder. And, this is a fairly simple question with a very unsimple answer, which is you started when you were Attorney General, and now you have focused like a laser on the importance of voting rights in our democracy. And so we have lots of teachers on this. We have lots of K-12 teachers. We have lots of higher ed faculty. What do you think is the most essential lessons about voting rights and their place in history that our students should really know? Give us a sense of what you're seeing, what is top of your mind about that. And also, and this is probably really hard, what the hell is going on in terms of voting rights in this election, and what can we do in the next 21 days to secure them?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Randy. With all these teachers looking, and I'm a little intimidated here. I'm not hoping we're not going to get graded on this, but I hope if we are, given the fact we've got Harvard professors here, I hope this is done on a curve or something like that, a very severe curve. Well, what I'd say is this, I'd say that throughout the history of America, there's been a push and pull as we seek to expand the right to vote for more people. It seems like, unfortunately, a couple of steps forward are oftentimes followed by, reactionary forces trying to pull us back, a couple of steps back. Following the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction. Now, it's been more studied, I think, in recent years, but it is, I think come to view it as a truly revolutionary time in our history. As formerly enslaved males finally had access to the ballot and held positions of leadership, throughout the South and represented the South in Congress. I mean, this was, of course, as we all know, met by a violent backlash that ushered in an era of Jim Crow that survived up until the Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And we've seen over the past decade, I think, another backlash. People have chipped away with the aid of the Supreme Court at the Voting Rights Act, and new forms of voter suppression have taken root. Gerrymandering, racial and partisan gerrymandering, voter purges, poll closures. Since the Supreme Court decision in 2013 that gutted the Voting Rights Act, there have been 1,700 polling places around the country that have been closed. The increased use of these discriminatory photo ID laws. And that all sounds, a little depressing. But I actually think there's cause for optimism. I think the history of this country and the forward progress that has come about has often been driven by, people who didn't hold, citizens who didn't hold any elected office or official title. I think about, one of my heroes, John Lewis, who just died, very recently. He was a kid when he marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he helped lead a movement for justice, for equality, led to the creation of the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights statutes. And so I focused mostly, on the history of voting rights as it relates to race. But I think we should also consider for a minute Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Before she ever joined the Supreme Court, she was a monumental figure in the law. If she had never been on the Supreme Court, she would have still been seen as a titan in the legal world. And her arguments as an advocate, for women's equality, changed people's views and also changed the laws in this country. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we might be in a dark place right now. And I truly believe that I agree with you totally, Randy. There are very serious threats to our democracy. I mean, our democracy is on the ballot. But we can't grow complacent, give in to hopelessness. I mean, I think now is the time for action. Chief among those things is getting out to vote. And what I would tell everybody, not only vote, but have a plan for voting. Don't wake up on November the 3rd and say, I'm going to go vote. You need to be thinking about what you're going to do now. Voting early, using the mails. But we talk about flattening the curve when it comes to our healthcare system with relation to the virus. I think we need to flatten the curve when it comes to our electoral system and have people cast their ballots as quickly as they can.
Thank you. I want to ask you, because I know you have to leave by 7 or 7:15. But let's have some hope for a moment, and if you were, November 4th or November 5th or November 15th, say you were talking to President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and there hasn't been an Attorney General proposed yet, but say for a second, again, I'm just thinking out loud, say there's a Senate majority that all of a sudden is interested in some real reform. I'm not going to ask you the question about the court. I'm going to ask you the question about what should the next administration do first 100 days in terms of protecting voting rights? What do they do in terms of gerrymandering? What do they do in terms of suppression? So many people who are not ensconced in this work, what's the first few steps to actually protect the sanctity of voting?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And one thing I would say that, we need to focus on what the new administration is going to do. But we also have to remember that this election season, we have the ability to put in place people at the state level who will play a big role in determining what the next decade looks like, or what the coming years will look like with regard to voting rights. So I would urge everybody to make sure that, in addition to voting for president, focus on those down ballot races as well. I think we have to figure out ways in which we end, there's not only the voter suppression that we've had to deal with, but ushering, new reforms that might make it easier to cast a ballot and bring more people to the table. And so, for instance, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that replaces the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was gutted by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision, passed that law. H.R. 1 are again passed already by the Democratic House that helps get money out of politics, reforms the redistricting process so that there's a greater emphasis on redistricting being done by these nonpartisan commissions. At the state level, again, a decade of maps that we could have, a decade of fair maps would give power back to the people who represent them. So again, having victories in those state level races and undoing the gerrymandering that was done in 2011 would be critical. And if you did that, you could then have state legislatures that could reverse those discriminatory voter ID laws. I'd also think that in terms of democracy, the opportunity to make Washington, D.C. a state, give Puerto Rico that same opportunity if that's the decision that they want to make. We have 700,000 people in Washington, D.C. I'm one of them. We pay taxes. Our sons and daughters serve in the military. We're good citizens. We don't have a true right to vote. A civil rights division at the Justice Department that protects voters as it's supposed to do. And I'll go there, with regard to the courts. I think we should enact court reform that expands the number of judges and puts term limits on the Supreme Court. I happen to think that 18-year terms for Supreme Court justices is enough, given the power that they have in unelected positions. So those are just some of the I think necessary and appropriate measures that would help us in having a more functioning, a more healthy democracy. Now, one of the keys to that is to win the election, for Joe Biden to win the election, win the Senate, and then importantly, make a structural change, and that is to do away with the filibuster. I don't think we're going to have 60 Democrats in the Senate. And to do all the things I've just outlined, I suspect we're going to need to have institutionalists, traditionalists in the Senate understand what's at stake and make what I think is a long overdue move to do away with the filibuster.
And the aim for anybody who's watching and listening, I have often heard Eric Holder talk about how it's the voters who should decide who gets elected. It should not be the elected official who gets to decide who the voters are. And what the redistricting issues, if you look at them, this is a matter of making sure that districting is done in a fair and nonpartisan way. And this has been an issue for both Democrats and Republicans in trying to create fair or safe seats. And so we have not had the kind of districting that actually ensures that people really get a free and fair vote. And so I want to say thank you to you. I know at one point or another you're going to have to get off, General Holder. So I just really want to thank you for all the work that you've done, for what you've written for us, and people have to listen to this Attorney General.
Well, Randy, you've been a great partner. Your organization has been great partners in this fight for fair redistricting. That's the deal. We're not fighting to gerrymander for Democrats. We just want to have a fair process, because I think if it's fair, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. Now, I've got to leave, but I'm going to stick around for as long as I can because I want to hear the other panelists. Fantastic.
Thank you. And I want to get to the next couple of questions, and then we'll have questions from or for Steve and for Daniel, and then we'll have questions for Suzanne. So your study of how democracy dies, you see these troubling developments in U.S. democracy. And most of the time, people see these things after it's too late. Both of you have spent your careers studying governments in other parts of the world. And so what do Americans, and here, we're focused on American school teachers who are teaching American students. So tell us, what have you learned from what happened in India, Brazil, Turkey, and Poland and Hungary that gives the warning signs for what could happen in the United States? And why do we need to know this? That's a big question. I'm sorry.
We need to know this because if we're not aware of what could happen, we could lose our democracy. A couple of things, and these are pretty straightforward. One, as you mentioned at the outset, Randy, is that democracies don't die the way they used to die. We're used to at least those of us my age and older, are used to democracy dying through military juntas, generals seizing power, dissolving Congress and the Constitution, and establishing an outright dictatorship. That happens in some places in the world, but by and large, today in the 21st century, most democracies die in a much more subtle way, in which elected leaders, elected presidents, elected prime ministers use the very institutions of democracy. They use elections, they use plebiscites, they use laws out of Congress or Parliament, they use Supreme Court rulings to subvert the very democratic process. We've seen it in Latin America, we've seen it in Central Europe, we've seen it in Africa and in Asia. And the risk there is that it's not always so obvious, right? The Constitution's still there, we still have elections, Congress is still operating. If you're not paying close attention, the system looks the same. It looks like a democracy. And yet a tremendous amount of damage can be done, to the point where you're in a place like Hungary today, or even Venezuela, where you have an outright authoritarian regime. The other lesson, which is quite obvious, but we need to take very seriously, is we have to be very careful who we elect. If you elect a leader who is not committed to democratic practice, to democratic norms, to constitutional norms, you're very likely going to get an assault on democratic institutions. We see it time and time again, whether it's Hugo Chavez, whether it is Erdogan in Turkey, and very clearly in the case of Donald Trump. If you elect somebody whose behavior and discourse before the election is not fully compatible with democratic practice and democratic norms, you're likely to get that in office. It's not rocket science, and yet we didn't pay attention.
The two of you had this amazing kind of description of what political parties do and how political parties in America in some ways used to be a check and balance to kind of screening out people who on the face of it ought not be qualified. Do you want to kind of go through what you said in the book about that? I would do it less justice than you. And I thought about it as I saw the Republican platform this year, or the lack thereof of it. And it reminded me of what you had written in How Democracies Die.
So I think one thing that's important to not do is to paint a kind of rose-colored picture of our own history. There's been authoritarians throughout our histories, there's been authoritarian tendencies throughout our history, but usually, to the benefit of our democracy, they've been sidelined. And so what that means is that political leaders, usually the nominees for the president, are not these kinds of figures. And even though there's people who've wanted to run for office, so in our book we recount Henry Ford wanted to be president. George Wallace wanted to be president. I mean, there's people with authoritarian tendencies throughout American history. But we've normally had a system in which political parties serve as gatekeepers, where party leaders filter out these sorts of figures. And in the past, this was done through the kind of infamous smoke-filled room. After the 1970s, with the introduction of primaries, it got to be a lot more difficult. But the point of this, though, is that people in positions of responsibility have great responsibility to filter out and to not form alliances with people who clearly are authoritarian in their discourse and in their behavior. And so, and this happens in other countries as well. Throughout history in other countries, mainstream politicians often face this incredible pressure, or they perceive it as a pressure, to align themselves with people who may have a popular base but are a complete threat to democracy. So whether one's talking about Italy in the 1920s, there was like these liberal statesmen who formed coalitions with Mussolini. And in our own history as well, I think what happened in 2016 is you had establishment politicians see somebody on the horizon who they thought they could ride to power and form an alliance, and in a way abdicate their position of responsibility. This ends up being, it's the same miscalculation happens over and over, where mainstream politicians think that they can tap into this and control the situation. And usually this is an alliance that backfires, and it ends up putting somebody in power who ultimately is a great threat to democracy. So, one of the big disappointments when we wrote this book is, we wrote this book in 2017, and we wrote it in part to Republican audiences with the expectation and hope that as violations democratic norms accumulated, Republicans would draw a hard line in the sand and say, we can't cooperate with this guy anymore. And one thing that's been really that's disappointed us and has made us more alarmed today than we were when we wrote the book is that hasn't happened. I mean, we've really seen very few instances of high-profile office-holding Republicans, people in office with something to lose, drawing a line in the sand. And so that's why, again, I think this election is so critical.
So what can we, from both of your perspectives, if you were teaching a high school class right now of people who are completely skeptical, I'll take my students who, started very cynical about government. Often, thinking that President Obama, for example, would be able to, I've heard this often, the president is kind of responsible for picking up the garbage in a municipality. Can't the president change or get a street light? There's a lot of not understanding, which levels of government do what, but part of that is because there's so many checks and balances, and there's not a lot of teaching government and the branches and the federalism in a way that kids really see agency. They see a lot of times this, you got to memorize this for the test. And, part of what we are trying to do long term is to make tests less significant and not even grade on a curve, General Holder, but to actually have project-based instruction to be able to do all this stuff. But given the kind of skepticism that, so many students come to American power and American voting with, we know that Donald Trump has done deep damage to American civic culture. I think, Daniel, you were just in the lack of Republican response. You see that. So the question becomes, assume for a second, just like I said, I asked General Holder, say Joe Biden is elected, say Kamala Harris is elected. What do we need to do in terms of civic culture? What kind of things do we need to suggest to actually try to recreate, re-envision maybe the norms, the muscle of democracy in a way that people feel empowered and engaged?
I think I would make 2 points. One, there's the kind of democratic skills component to this, where I think it's really critical in this. I know this happens to some degree already, but even at elementary school level, to teach children democratic skills. And so I just spent the past year in Germany, where I spent some time talking to people who are involved in democratic pedagogy, as it's called there. And one of the things they do is to have in elementary schools to teach children to set agendas for meetings, to moderate discussions. Elementary school age children to develop these democratic skills. That's really important, starting at a very young age. But I think a second thing is actually knowledge, substantive knowledge about our political process. This doesn't mean, though, the kind of usual stuff about the checks and balances and so on. I think actually what's missing in your question, Randy, I think gets to this, which is I think that people don't have a sufficient understanding of how politics works in their own communities. Yeah. I think fourth graders should go to town council meetings and watch this on field trips and understand what's being discussed. And actually, in the age of COVID, when schools are being shut down, and school boards and school superintendents are holding meetings, I think for the first time, students understand there's people making decisions about my life that affect me. And so I think this is an incredible opportunity for people to see politics on the ground, decisions being made that affect children's lives. They can then begin to see that this stuff matters. And I think understanding how politics at a very local level is one area where in my sense, is that even more emphasis should be placed upon.
I completely agree with you. And, it's one of the things, but it is one of these ideas about how do we find ways in a non-political way to institute this in a curriculum. to, that no one is wearing an independent or Democratic or Republican, sleeve, and one is just really thinking about how we empower kids to understand how local government works, and with that, to actually be engaged in civitas. I just want to say before we get to Suzanne, I want to, I'm kind of sort of rushing through some of this to give a taste to our audience to be able to ask whatever questions. If people don't have a lot of questions, I'm going to just create some, a conversation amongst and between all of us, which, I yearn for. And I've been really, really looking forward to this. So let me just ask this of Suzanne, because I've been dying to ask you this question since Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee tweeted the following, and I quote, "Democracy isn't the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are." So you head up Penn. You're dedicated to defending the liberty and human rights of writers and authors. And as an author yourself of this very important book on freedom of expression, how is it possible to have liberty without democracy?
Yeah, look, I don't think it is. I mean, I think the idea of liberty without democracy is just a prelude to what Daniel talked about a few minutes ago, which is liberty that is inherently vulnerable, that is going to be taken away at the whim of the powerful. And I worry a little bit about how we balance something else that you spoke about, which is the role of party insiders and leaders as a mediating force, because I think some would hear Mike Lee's comment as an invitation to that, that by leaving things in the hands of the masses, you take a risk. And I've heard other people talk about how they feel about President Trump and that kind of abdication or loss of control among party leaders that may have led to his emergence at the forefront of the field. And so, I think it's important to stress as we talk about these issues that we really, as you said, Randi, it is about the consent of the governed, that it's not about a backroom kind of manipulation, and that we ultimately, I think the framers of our Constitution didn't believe that any of our rights would be truly safeguarded unless we had a secure, stable democracy that with the ability to hold our leaders accountable. And without the democratic process, that falls away.
So what do you say, Suzanne? Because it's, people like all of us are very engaged in this work. This work is kind of second nature to us. It's part of the reason why it was, I kind of stopped the first time I heard General Holder say, redistricting is really about, it shouldn't be the people empowered dictating who's empowered, it should be the people who vote dictating who gets to govern them. And I had never even thought about it that way. I mean, it's obvious, but it just became a way that one could actually look at redistricting through a lens of fairness as opposed to through a lens of power. But the issue about protest and the intersection of protest and democracy, we often talk about our voice is our vote. But on so many baseline matters, protest is our voice as well. So how do, particularly right now, Suzanne, with all of the protests in response and in light of what happened to George Floyd, the murder we all saw on TV because a young lady, a high school student of one of our members, was able to film it, and the protests that happened afterwards, and then the manipulation of that protest by Donald Trump. How do we teach our students about the right to protest, but also how protest fits within short-term and long-term political change in a democracy?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think we, as we have a discussion about the ways in which civic education and sort of the rudiments of citizenship have fallen away and what we need to do to shore those up. I think freedom of assembly is a critical part of that. We've done a report at PEN America, which we released just right on the eve of the George Floyd protests, called Arresting Dissent, that looks across the 50 states and documents dozens of restrictions on protest rights that have been implemented and proposed at the state level. And so there has been, under cover of the Trump administration, Republican legislators, in response to Women's March protests against the Muslim ban, and other progressive mobilizations over the last few years, there's been this backlash in the form of all kinds of restrictions on where you can protest, when you can protest, stiffening the penalties for legal infringements during protests. And so this is a set of rights that we really need to assert much more forcefully and protect. And in the course of the George Floyd, the protest sparked by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we saw rampant infringements on protest rights by overly aggressive police. We saw documented hundreds of violations of press freedom rights in the course of those protests, journalists who were arrested, detained, in some cases attacked, foreign journalists who are knocked over and bulldozed in the course of performing their duties, and a real embarrassment to the United States around the world in terms of the headlines that were made in relation to the handling of those protests. And we know that if President Trump has his way, he would have shut them down much more forcefully. We saw what he did in Lafayette Park. And so I think for young people and all citizens, understanding what your rights are when you go out to demonstrate, what rules are legitimate, what constitutes police overreach, how to handle the situation if things get unsteady and out of hand, how to protect yourself. Those are lessons that we are doing trainings on at PEN America, both for activists and organizers and for members of the press who are covering these protests. And I hope that as we move forward in an effort to rebuild our democracy, this will be an important piece of it. We learned something during the Trump years, which was getting that muscle memory of resistance mobilized again. People, were coming out in the streets in some cases for the first time in many years. Young people now are accustomed to doing so on climate change and other issues. And so I think this is a very important piece of our civic education that we need to attend to.
So,
could I say one thing?
Yes, please.
To link back to your question, so I begged Daniel to take the question about what we could teach our students, and I thank him for doing that. But I regretted it, because I think there's a really important link to these last few questions, which is participation in rights movements, participation in protest is one of the very best schools for teaching democracy. No generation, no set of citizens in this country are more committed and more important to reinforcing democratic practice and democratic rights in this country than those who emerged out of the civil rights movement. Same thing going back to the abolition movement. The movements that fought for our freedoms and that democratized this country over the course of 200 years spawned thousands of citizens. One learns about rights, one learns about the law, one learns about agency and what one can do participating in protest movements, and one learns also how to negotiate, how to be tolerant. Organizing and participating in a protest movement is a tremendously important school for democracy and for Democrats.
You see that in the labor movement of people who have been engaged in strikes, and the different kind of comedy that happens for people who have been engaged in that kind of struggle on the streets. And also, I think what you're saying, Stephen, is it's also a matter of people starting to see some sacrifice and that kind of binding together in terms of that. And that leads me, and this is for all of you, that leads me also to kind of my next question, which is what this is a question from the audience. So first the question is, what are the legal options if President Trump refuses to concede the election? But the corollary question off of what both Suzanne and Stephen just talked about is, what's the protest options? Like, what do you envision in terms of both the legal options and what are the protest options?
Well, maybe I'll start with the legal options. I mean, one thing people need to understand that let's assume that Joe Biden wins the election. He is certified by the Electoral College. January 20th at noon, Donald Trump ceases to be president of the United States. Full stop. The guy with the nuclear codes and the football, the handbag, he moves over to Joe Biden. The military, salutes. Joe Biden is now commander in chief. So in terms of, it's not a question of Donald Trump saying, all right, I've decided I want to go. Our system is set up in such a way that he has to go. Now, so I don't think the problem is necessarily a legal one. The question is what happens between November the 3rd and January the 20th if Trump wants to say that I don't believe the results, these mail-in ballots are rife with fraud, they shouldn't be counted. I mean, obviously, then we have to, fight maybe potentially, state by state, legislature by legislature, state court by state court, ultimately potentially rule with cases finding their way to the United States Supreme Court. So there are legal options, in leading up to that ultimate determination. But once that determination is made, that is a winner declared by the Electoral College, Trump can certainly foment, I worry about this, all kinds of, negative behavior on the streets, worry about violence. And he doesn't seem like he wants to tamp that down. But in terms of the legal things, file lawsuits, get into court, and then get to January 20th at noon, and whatever he says, I mean, you have to kind of, drag him out of the White House. He's not the president of the United States.
So we're not going to see, if Joe Biden wins the Electoral College, I'm gonna go and raise another scenario. But Joe Biden wins the Electoral College. Congress says that in December. Then what happens is we're not going to see Clarence Thomas swearing in Donald Trump and the Chief Justice swearing in Joe Biden.
I don't see that happening. The concern I have is not with that kind of scenario, but more with one where Trump refuses to accept the results of the election and then foments, all kinds of behaviors on the streets that are problematic, tries to delegitimize the election to somehow have a negative impact on Biden and Democrats' ability to govern. But he's not thinking these cosmic kinds of thoughts. This will all be just about him, trying to, keep power for him as long as is possible. Because one of the realities is that he faces is that when he's no longer president of the United States, all the doctrines that exist in the Justice Department, which I don't think are right, by the way, that say you can't indict a sitting president, those all melt away. And so in addition to whatever political concerns he has very personal reasons for wanting to stay in power as long as he can.
So that leads me, and I was going to ask it as a protest question, but why don't I ask it from one of the people watching have asked. And they said, I am concerned that President Trump incites and promotes violence. What is the most constructive way of responding to that? Anyone want to take that?
Look, I think this is very likely at this point. I mean, I think it's almost certain that Donald Trump will not accept defeat in the way that we're accustomed. I think it's almost certain that he will cry fraud. Now, that's not the same thing as staying in power after the Electoral College has voted. I agree entirely with Attorney General Holder, but he will scream fraud, and that will incite. And we have already seen. Daniel and I used to talk about the possibility or the likelihood that Trump's discourse would result in violence. This is no longer abstract theoretical stuff. We've suffered 4 political deaths in the last 2 months. We suffered 3 political deaths in the month of August. It's already happening. And so I think this is likely to occur. In part, it's going to depend a lot on elites. It's going to depend a lot on the position that Fox News and that key Republican leaders take. I hope, I'm not very confident, but I hope that they will call upon Republicans to accept the result. But ultimately, the part of small d and big D Democrats, Trump is going to try to incite chaos. Chaos is Trump's friend in this crucial period between November 3rd and when the Electoral College actually votes. And protest may be very, very important, but it's also incredibly important that it be nonviolent protest, and that opponents of Trump don't give Trump an excuse to sort of claim violence on both sides, or that the other side is acting in an authoritarian way. That the chaos is Trump's ally.
Yeah, just to maybe add to that, I think one element just in the next few weeks as we prepare for Election Day, even recognizing Election Day is not really election the day in the way that we are used to thinking about it, both from the perspective that so many people are casting their votes now, and because there's a strong likelihood that we won't know the final result as we're accustomed to on election night. But nonetheless, I think one of the efforts underway now, we see this in our work on disinformation, is to sow doubt and to sow a sense of chaos and to convince Americans that the election is going to be muddy and a mess and that they may not be able to trust the result and that anything could happen. I think that's a way of suppressing the vote, a way of convincing people that their vote may not matter, a way of intimidating people from participating in the process because it seems so shaky and uncertain. And so I think in terms of messaging, I know a lot of people in the audience are teachers. The messaging that we are trying to put across is that, look, this isn't an election unlike any other. It's unprecedented in many ways because of mail-in ballots. But look, our systems are strong. Our secretaries of state know what they're doing. We actually have a lot of experience with mail-in ballots. We know that they're not any more vulnerable to fraud than our electoral system as a whole, and that levels of fraud there are minuscule and incredibly low, and that we will proceed and we can get through this, and people will be patient if they have to wait online at the polls. That doesn't necessarily spell chaos or disaster. It may just be that people are carrying out social distancing or turning out in great numbers. And so a kind of measured message to instill a sense of calm so that people feel motivated to go to the polls, they aren't afraid, I think is extremely important as we move forward toward Election Day.
Can I just add one?
I'm sorry. This is a great conversation. Okay. I'd love to stay. Thank you for having me, my fellow panelists. You're great. You all get A's. Argue for me that I get more than a gentleman's C, please. I will see you all soon.
As long as General Holder, you come back again, you will never get a gentleman's C.
That's the best offer I've had in a long time. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. I wanted to add one other thing that I think is really critical, which is that in the face of this kind of situation, one of the things that becomes very difficult is to keep a kind of common, united coalition of people together who disagree on lots of things, but who are all committed to democracy. I mean, so I've been impressed the degree to which, for instance, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have kind of, come together, that their supporters have come together, and there's a kind of recognition of the scale of despite any differences, the scale of the threat. One possible concern is that after November 3rd, sort of the idea is that, okay, well, now we've made it through this date, we can sort of begin infighting among friends and among allies. And I think that of course, there's always room for disagreement in politics, but there also has to be a recognition that if we're in this period of incredible uncertainty and possible violence and so on, that those who are committed to democratic rules and norms, despite significant policy differences, need to work together and need to be tolerant of each other's differences. And so I think that's going to also be really critical in this period as well.
Thank you for all of that. I would actually, that actually gets to another, I now have so many questions. I'm just trying to, it gets to another question about just norms, not what we do after November 3rd, but let me kind of push us a bit to how do we reconstruct some of these norms of democracy? So, for example, one question was, I'm very pessimistic about the state of democracy now. Sorry, I'm just reading the questions. I want to make sure that I get it right. I'm very pessimistic about the state of democracy right now. How do we reestablish the norms of democratic government, such as the concept of a loyal opposition? And whether it's within a party itself or whether it is the two parties, and this whole notion or concept of either bipartisanship or the kind of loyal opposition that you can have these fierce fights about policy, but you still actually believe in the issue of democracy. How do we recreate that where people of this current generation doesn't see that as just as being just cynical, like they're thinking that there's a backroom deal instead of that is a commonplace practice within an ongoing mature democracy?
Well, I think it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be immediate. I think it's going to be a while before our parties are able to engage in sort of productive or healthy bipartisanship. I think it's important to point out that the polarization and the erosion of norms and particularly the erosion of the norm of what Daniel and I call mutual toleration, accepting the legitimacy of one's rival. That's eroded in a very asymmetric way. It is primarily the Republicans that have abandoned that norm over the last generation. And I think it's going to take a transformation of the Republican Party to get back to a place where the two parties are able to peacefully coexist. The Republican Party today is a party that overwhelmingly represents white Christians, which are an odd group, a special group in the United States, because they were once, in all of our lifetimes, an overwhelmingly dominant electoral majority, and also at the top of every social, economic, cultural, political hierarchy in this country. And as everybody in the audience knows, that's changed dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. But that loss of majority status, that loss of a dominant social status is deeply threatening. And that is what, at least Daniel and I believe, has ultimately fueled the radicalization of the Republican Party. And today, as long as the Republicans remain basically a representative of a fearful and resentful white Christian majority in decline, they are going to be prone to anti-democratic extremism. And the one problem, so what has to happen is the Republicans need to lose. Parties change. Parties change their strategy, reshuffle their base, expand their base when their pre-existing strategies don't work, when they lose big. So the first step is to deliver the Republican Party a series of electoral shellackings. There's one hitch to this, though, in the United States, which is that through no fault of the Republicans, our electoral institutions now are overwhelmingly biased towards the Republican Party because our electoral institutions, the Electoral College and the Senate, are biased towards sparsely populated territories. They favor the Republicans. The Republicans are able to maintain control of the Senate without winning national majorities. They're able to retain control of the presidency, and we all know the Supreme Court, without winning national majorities. According to Nate Silver, it will now take a 4 or 5 point victory by Biden just to be sure that he's going to win the Electoral College. It takes the Democrats a 6 or 7 point victory in the popular vote for the Senate to assure that they win a majority of Senate seats. Democrats can't just win by 50.1% of the vote. They need to win by 52, 53, 54 That is profoundly undemocratic, and it makes it easier for the Republicans to not change. Because if they can stay in power with just 46% of the vote, rather than having to win 51, they will do so. And so that points to the importance of the reforms that Attorney General Holder was pointing to at the beginning of our discussion, which is forms that make it much easier for people to register and vote, that make it much easier for us to express popular majorities, eliminating the filibuster. I agree with him on the introduction of statehood for DC, ways that get us closer to majority rule.
Yeah. And just to add, I mean, I think there's a whole layer of efforts to restore democracy that kind of have to happen simultaneously. One that's top of mind for us at PEN America is press freedom, where the U.S.'s leadership role on press freedom has been completely gutted, both in terms of the president's own treatment of the press, his threats and attacks and acts of retaliation against journalists, which are the basis of a lawsuit that we're pursuing against him. Right now we see the just complete politicization and perversion of the Voice of America and Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe. These tit for tat wars that are undercutting the ability of American journalists to cover China and other countries around the world. So, that's just one example. At the politicization of the Justice Department, there's going to be a whole kind of, as there was after Watergate, a whole set of legislative proposals aimed to address the weaknesses that we witnessed over the last 4 years. And I think getting those through, if and when we do have a majority over those first couple of years is going to be extremely important. And the other, Steve didn't mention this, but also just the pendulum swing, where we know it's very likely whatever happens this November, it will swing in the opposite direction in November of 2022. So time may be short. And then, the final thing I would mention is just this complete deficit of trust that, to me, is just undercutting progress on any of these issues and any possibility of restoring a loyal opposition. And I think for a Biden administration, transparency at every level and kind of trust building. And, we've seen some interesting examples of that at the state level in response to the pandemic. And I'm in New York City, and I actually think Governor Cuomo has done a great job in building a sense of common purpose in fighting the pandemic through transparency and disclosure on a really rigorous religious basis throughout the crisis. And I think that may offer an example that could work at a national level as well.
So thank you for that. And I know we're starting to run out of time, but there's this question that I'm like dying to ask all of you, which is, let's assume for a second that authoritarianism arises out of the consent of the governed. So let's assume that there are many people who align themselves with policies and political figures that uphold white supremacy, that uphold or promote homophobia, transphobia, who want to strip women of reproductive rights, who are willing to ignore the racism that is attendant in a killing of Breonna Taylor, and an attorney general who doesn't make it clear that what the charges could be. So what happens if there are authoritarianism governments that are elected, that come from the consent of the government? What do you think our responsibility is? We're all teachers or concerned citizens. What would our responsibility be at that moment in time?
So in a sense, I'm not going to answer your question, because I think that the premise is, I don't want to diminish the nature of these kinds of threats that you just described, or diminish the idea that there are significant segments of our population, and possibly growing segments of our population and other countries' populations, that take these stances, and that's certainly a genuine threat. But I think the point that Steve made before, that this may be at best 40% of the population. That's really overstating the threat. I think this is more like 30%, 20% of the population. And I think we're in a, and so I think there's a reason not to answer your question, because I think by posing the question that there are majorities who hold these views, it's mischaracterizing the nature of the threat. I mean, I think the threat actually is that we have significant segments of the population who may hold these views, but these aren't majorities. And so the question is, how do we get the democratic majorities to be the ones in charge? I mean, and so, take an example like the country of Hungary, which Steve mentioned before. Viktor Orban was able, through kind of electoral maneuvers of drawing of districts, is able to create super majorities in the parliament. 2/3 of the parliament was of his party, which then allowed him to redraw, do all sorts of constitutional changes that empowered him further, playing on people's racism and anti-immigrant fears and so on. But the actual percentage of the population that ever supported Orban was never 2/3 of the population. This was an inflated value because of the kind of electoral maneuvering. So I think actually the real challenge is how to prevent significant minorities of authoritarian tendencies from taking on an outsized role in our political system. That's the real challenge.
So thank you, Daniel. And that actually brings me to a question that we have that is particularly relevant. I'm going to put Suzanne on the spot. What do we do about Fox News?
Well, it's a tough one, actually. We at PEN America are trying to engage Fox News in the run-up to the election. We have an event, and it's open to the public tomorrow afternoon on the decision desk. And we've got people from the decision desks at CNN, the Associated Press, and Fox News who are coming to talk about how they are going to do their projections and their calling of the election this time around. And our effort really is to try to instill a common conversation among professional journalists who do this work to talk about the responsibilities that they have during this unprecedented election and how they can carry out their work in a responsible way. In terms of Fox News more broadly, it's a real challenge. I don't see the potential under the First Amendment to regulate it out of existence. I don't think our equal time rules are coming back or that we'll be able to restore them. And so I think it comes down to really the work of your members and educators to instill in a rising generation a sense of discernment in what they're looking at, not just in terms of Fox News, but also the information that they gain on social media, where overwhelmingly most young people are absorbing the vast bulk of their news content because, well, we have a generation that has not been schooled in how to ferret out disinformation, in what professional journalism consists of and why you should credit it, and what the indices and measures are to determine whether a report is to be believed, how you might verify it. So we're doing a lot of education right now, but I think this is something that needs to be part of our curricula going forward so that, as young people swim in this sea of information, both on cable and online, they know how to navigate it.
So I'm going to actually put kind of like final thoughts here because, I want to see if we can kind of end by about 7:50, which is all of you have put so many things, including Attorney General Holder, on the table, from issues like transparency to trust to engaging kids in local government, to doing project-based learning, to understanding all of these different aspects and norms of democracy, to what the consent of the governed really means in free and fair elections. There's so much to unpack here. But here, we're 21 days before the election season, the official election season ends. What's the kind of last thought that you would give to this group of educators as we embark in these last 21 days and then whatever happens afterwards? All three of you, what's your last thoughts? And Leo too, what's your last thoughts they would give a group of people who have signed up for a couple of hours to talk about democracy with these, with all three of you who are amazing writers and thinkers and patriots. I'm going to start with Suzanne this time.
All right. I'd say three things. I mean, one is to avoid being caught up in what some are trying to instill, which is this sense of the inevitability of chaos and the unreliability of the election and a feeling of panic. I think we have to resist that. The second is don't be a vector for disinformation. If you see something that seems outlandish or surprising or shocking to you, go and check it, verify it, make sure it's factual before you send it on or put it on your feed or sound the alarm bells with your friend group. Make sure that you're absorbing a variety of news sources so that you can make sense of things without being overwhelmed by a single point of view that may not reflect reality. And then finally, have agency. As you say, Randi, this may come down to a matter of protests in the streets. There may come a moment where we have to peacefully assemble on the National Mall in order to ensure that the results of this election are honored. And so we need to be prepared for that. The thing that, to me is most terrifying about authoritarian societies is the passivity. The fact that you have, in a place like Russia or Iran or China, just this acquiescence in the complete denial of rights and justice in case after case. And that really frightens me. So I think teachers have an incredibly important role to play as nodes in the system as we navigate these complex days ahead. So thanks to all of you for having me and for this important conversation.
Thank you, Suzanne. Stephen, Daniel, who wants to take it next?
I want to just really agree entirely with Suzanne. I think it's incredibly important at this stage to resist the temptation to freak out and to panic, because that can have the incredibly counterproductive effect of seriously undermining confidence in the electoral process and possibly demobilizing people. We need to, the most important thing is, as Attorney General Holder was saying before we went on air, the most important thing is to win, is to win this election and to throw the autocrat out of power. And for that to happen, everybody's got to vote. And so, and for everybody to vote, everybody has to have confidence that their vote will matter, even if in some corner of our brain we're worried about the chaos, the shenanigans that can occur between November 3rd and the end of December. That we need to focus now on everybody having a plan to vote and believing that they're going to be able to vote and that their vote will matter. And at the same time, and I don't mean to contradict myself here, but we do need to be prepared, if necessary, to take to the streets in a patriotic defense of democracy, to do what many of our generation have never had to do, but we may need to do.
Thank you, Stephen. Daniel?
You're muted.
You're muted.
All right. I agree with everything everybody said and fully agree. Yeah, but I guess the one final bit of this to kind of round it out in a way is just to remember that democracy, I agree entirely. It's about this election and winning is everything here, but the democracy is kind of slow grinding work. And in the best case scenario, we're going to, come to January and, to not accept the diagnosis. Well, see, our checks and balances work. We can all go back to stop paying attention. But this is we're in this for the long haul, and to really repair our democracy and to prevent this from happening again, or prevent something worse from happening, we need to remain committed in the same way that we are right now.
Leo, you want to, before I close up, why don't you just intervene
Sure.
here, since you think about these topics all the time?
So teachers are the first responders for American democracy. We've been forced into that role. And what we need to do now is discuss with our students what needs to be done. We have these articles that the three people here and Attorney General Holder wrote, which are available online, so you can use them, you can discuss them with your students. But more importantly, there needs to be a positive kind of result from that discussion. You need to talk to your students about how to develop plans for them if they're old enough, certainly for their families on how to vote, on how to protect the vote, how to make sure the vote will be counted. And you need to impress upon them the theme we've talked to here today about the importance of not only voting, but if we need to engage in nonviolent protests to ensure the vote is, and the verdict of the vote is
So
respected.
I think what we're saying, first off, I cannot thank Suzanne Nossel, Stephen Livitsky, Daniel Ziblatt, and Attorney General Eric Holder enough for tonight's conversation. I've written tons and tons of notes on my notes, and you've taught me a lot tonight. But I think that what we're also all saying to everyone who's watching, and I think, Steve, you said it as best as I've ever heard anybody say it, don't resist the temptation to freak out. There's a lot of things that may happen, but we have two things that we have to resist. We have many things that we have to resist, but right now, front in mind, we have to resist the cynicism that says, my vote doesn't matter, nothing's going to change, and so many people who don't vote because of that. We have to get everybody out to vote. Everybody's vote matters. And part of what we have to do is get everybody's vote to count after everybody does vote. So we have to resist the cynicism. That has been the problem for generations, or for, years and years before this. The second piece is we have to resist the chaos. The chaos that Donald Trump and his minions are trying to plan, are doing right now. We saw what happened in terms of what happened in Michigan with some operatives doing robocalls, scaring people to resist out of voting, pretending that they would be arrested if they voted. We see it now in terms of what's happening in California, where there are fake drop boxes. So we have to get out there the importance of this election and the importance of voting and having a plan to vote. And then what we have to do is the kind of work that all of you have talked about, including Leo and Attorney General Holder, that our democracy is imperfect. It's been imperfect since 1776. It's imperfect today, but it is the best thing we have to creating a government that is based upon the consent of the governed. And there is no better way of actually making sure that people have a voice. But we have to do things like creating more transparency, creating more ability for young people to learn about local governments and have agency because of that, to actually make it become real, and then to actually do the long-term reforms that were talked about earlier. But there's no better group that I know of to actually have had this kind of well-informed discourse and discussion about democracy, the role of freedom of association, the role of freedom of assembly, the role of freedom of expression, the role of voting, the role of all the other things that we've talked about today. And so I just can't thank all of you enough for joining us today. So thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Attorney General Holder, who had to leave early. And thank you, Leo. And thank you, everyone who've watched us. And most importantly, vote and have a plan to vote in this election by mail, in person, early, or on November 3rd. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good night.